Mr. Speaker, the Minister of State-Owned Enterprises, the chap in charge of selling our state assets, had 10 minutes to stand up and tell this House to justify to New Zealand the rationale around why he is going to sell our power companies. And you know what that minister did? He spent 5 minutes talking about the Labour Party reshuffle. Not once did the Minister of State-Owned Enterprises justify to New Zealand the rationale behind why he will sell our power companies. Tell you what, it just about says it all, doesn't it? There is no plan, there's no rationale, and there's no justification. Mr. Speaker, there are only 3 things I would like to speak about today. The first one is inequality, the growing gap in our communities between the few that have an awful lot and the many that have very little. The second point is the reality gap. By that I mean the gap between the words the Prime Minister uses and the policies his government puts in place. And the third one, it's a very simple question: where is the plan? Very simple question, very difficult to answer, but I think it's about time, after 2 years, that the people of New Zealand had an answer to the question of where is the plan. Mr. Speaker, let's start with inequality. In this House yesterday, I asked a question that went something like this: is it fair when someone earning $1 million a year receives a tax cut of $1,000 a week, and when someone on the median wage gets around $15 a week? Is that fair? Now, Mr. English had the nerve to stand up in this House and say there is no inequality in that tax policy at all, because the economic models told him so. So let me get this right. There is no inequality, so it's perfectly fair that someone earning $1 million gets $1,000 a week and someone on the median wage gets $15.
Very quiet now.
Really? Really? Well, if that isn't inequality, then I don't know what is. And I suspect that Mr. English's definition of inequality differs significantly from mine, because for me, $1,000 a week versus $15 a week sure sounds unequal and unfair. Now, Mr. Speaker, the drive to implement the philosophy behind equality of opportunity drives me. It's why I'm here, because what I believe is that every New Zealander should have the opportunity to be as good as he or she can be. As members of Parliament, it is our responsibility to ensure that all New Zealanders get this opportunity. And Mr. Speaker, the government is failing in this role. Education is one example. In Napier, Mr. Speaker, the high schools used to be hives of activity after dark. People came from all over the city to interact, to learn, to better themselves. I drive past my old school of Napier Boys High School now. After dark, the lights are out, there's no one home. Why? Because $13 million were cut from adult and community education budget. This pretty much killed night classes in Napier. There is no equality in this. 10,000 people in Hawke's Bay used to take night classes, now none do. Mr. Speaker, before these classes closed, I met a young woman who had just left school, and she was learning to sew so she could make her own clothes. Gone. I met a retired woman who was learning to quilt to make presents for her family. Gone. I also met a woman who was learning Italian. Now, this woman was learning Italian. She was told by Napier's national MP that if she could afford to go to Italy, then she could afford to pay for her night classes. Well, wrong. The reason this woman was learning Italian is because her grandkids lived in Italy and she wanted to be able to talk to them. And you know what? She can't afford to go to night classes. That's gone. Napier's people are poorer for it. New Zealanders are poorer for it. And the gap between the very wealthy and those who are struggling continues to grow. Where is the fairness and the equality there? There is none. Now, Mr. Speaker, I would like to talk about the reality gap. We all know in November 2008, Mr. Key looked down the camera and he said to every New Zealander, under National, I will not cut GST. National will not increase GST. He said that. National will not increase GST. And you know what? He did. Phil Goff will never break his promise. Phil Goff will never break his promise. And perhaps that is the difference between the two men. Mr. Key broke a fundamental election promise. Mr. Goff will not. How can the people of New Zealand now trust Mr. Key when he says we will only sell 49% of state assets? Because he said he wouldn't? That simply doesn't cut it anymore. They cannot believe his words anymore. They are hollow. Here are some other things Mr. Key said in last year's statement to Parliament. 12 months ago, Mr. Key said, the good news is that New Zealand has weathered the worst of the global financial crisis, and New Zealanders can be pleased on how well the country has come through it. If Mr. Key believes that over 150,000 unemployed and a government borrowing $300 million a week are indicators that we have come through this recession, then someone organise that man another focus group. His finance minister now believes we are in double-dip recession. But the sad thing is we could have avoided this with a good plan for economic development and growth. Mr. Key believed he could muddle on through and it would all be okay. Well, Mr. Key, you are not at Merrill Lynch now. Another quote from the Prime Minister 12 months ago. 2009 was not an easy year for many people. Some lost their jobs, some their savings, and others their confidence. Yet things are definitely looking up. Mr. Key said this 12 months ago. He told us last year that things were looking up. Wrong. Why? He had no plan except to mine national parks. No plan, and the country is spiralling towards double recession. You are very definitely not at Merrill Lynch now, Mr. Key. He also said in last year's statement to Parliament, and I quote, the policies we intend to introduce this year will be a big part of the country's improvement this year, next year, and into the future. That's what Mr. Key said a year ago. Let me repeat that. The policies we intend to introduce this year will be a big part of the country's improvement. The major policy of last year, Mr. Speaker, was to increase GST to pay tax cuts for the very wealthy. That's cruel. That is cruel. We are now going backwards, and that is a fact the opposition cannot argue against. There were no policies introduced last year, Mr. Speaker, that improved the economy or the country. The country, this government, simply has no plan. Mr. Speaker, I have spoken about inequality and how the policies of this government have introduced the gap between the very wealthy and the rest. Mr. Speaker, I have shown that the rhetoric from Mr. Key simply does not match the policies of his government. And I have reiterated time and time again, please show us the plan. The government is playing with the lives of 4.5 million New Zealanders, and it has no plan on how to cope with a double-dip recession. And Mr. Speaker, it is simply not good enough. Thank you very much.